Hello and welcome to Trinity Bible Media. This is the fourth video in our Introduction to Genesis series, and we are continuing on the topic of authorship. As we saw in the last few episodes of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all tightly bound to one another in terms of authorship and audience and purpose. And while there was probably some level of editing at a later date, the unanimous testimony of Scripture is that Moses was the one who wrote those first 5 books. But of course, just like everything else in the world, not everyone agrees with that. In fact, Mosaic authorship has been under fire for the better part of the last 200 years. And so for the sake of thoroughness, today we're going to take a look at what the skeptics have to say. We're going to discuss the most prominent attack on Mosaic authorship, which is known as either JEDP Theory or the documentary hypothesis. You'll understand shortly where those names come from. So in this video, we're going to cover some of the history and formation of the theory. In the next video, we're going to take a look at some of the specifics and demonstrate why it's so misguided. Now, the history of this thing is a bit complicated. It's got a lot of twists and turns. But I do think it's helpful to the Bible student to understand how the notion came about. And once you do, it tends to, at least in my opinion, throw the theory's credibility into question pretty quickly. Now, I am trying to present a fair and accurate depiction of the theory's history, but don't think that what I'm about to present here is exhaustive in any way. To be sure, there are important names being left out, names like Simon, Leclerc, and Groff. Even so, I do believe it's a fair and reasonable account of the theory's history, and it should be able to give you a flavor of the theory's origins. So let's dig in, going back all the way to the Age of Enlightenment. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the general atmosphere of the so-called Enlightenment was one of rebellion against divine revelation. Human reason had become king, meaning that the Bible was seen as merely another product of human imagination. Everything in it had to be explained by naturalistic causes. In the midst of all this, thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza began to question the literary coherence of the Pentateuch. They claimed that there were inconsistencies and contradictions within its pages. Most prominently, they called attention to the fact that God is referred to by different names: Elohim, Yahweh, El Shaddai. They didn't recognize any theological significance in these names. They just thought of the Bible as being inconsistent. In 1753, physician John Ostrach, in an effort, it seems, to defend the Bible against the attacks from these accusations, began to identify what he believed to be remnants of underlying sources of the Pentateuch. He distinguished these sources primarily by the way in which God was referred to by different names. For example, in Genesis 1, the name Elohim is used. In Genesis 2, he is primarily referred to as Yahweh, which is rendered as Lord in all caps in English Bibles. Ostrach theorized that Moses had combined 2 different independent documents of unknown origin, each with their own creation account, as the basis of the 2 chapters. In academic circles, the Genesis 2 document, where the name Yahweh is prominent, began to be referred to as J. The German spelling of Yahweh starts with a J. The Genesis 1 document, where the name Elohim is used, is known as E, as in E for Elohim. So with Ostrach, we have 2 hypothetical source documents, J and E, with Moses being the one who brought them together. The trend of breaking apart Genesis and assigning the pieces to a multitude of source documents had been set in motion. At first, in the case of Ostrach, it was said that Moses was the one who cut and pasted these documents into a single work. But it soon became fashionable to attribute it to anonymous editors much later, like 1,000 years later. In 1805, Willem Martin Lebrecht Dewitt postulated that none of the Pentateuch originated after the time of David, who lived around 1000 BC, or several centuries after Moses. More significantly, he said that the book of Deuteronomy sounded a lot like the description of the book of the law, which was found in the temple during King Josiah's reign in 2 Kings 22. So DeWitt asserted that King Josiah and Hilkiah, the high priest, would have been united in the goal of abolishing the worship and sacrifice everywhere except for Jerusalem. They could pull that off. It would unify all of the tribes of the kingdom under King Josiah and ensure that all of the revenues would flow in directly to the temple under Hilkiah. And so, as DeWitt's story goes, the book of Deuteronomy was cooked up, planted, and then discovered in the temple in order to facilitate this scheme. In other words, the book of Deuteronomy is very much not the product of divine inspiration. Instead, DeWitt said it was fabricated as propaganda by these 2 men for the purpose of expanding their own power. Do you see why this theory is such a big deal now? All of this would have happened around 621 BC, which is the year that Josiah destroyed all of the pagan altars throughout the land. See 2 Kings 22 for the details. And so we have a new document, D, which stands for Deuteronomist, which is entirely separate in origin from the other two documents, J and E. So at this point, the theory proposes three documents, J, E, and D, and it's also completely disconnected Moses from the writing of the Pentateuch. Now, it should be observed that the people who do this so-called scholarship, as a rule, do not trust the historicity of the narratives found in the Bible. Yet Dewitt takes the detail about Hilkiah finding the book of the law in the temple to be historically accurate. He doesn't trust the narrative where it says explicitly that the Lord approved of Josiah's actions. He just believes the detail of finding the book of the law. Why would he accept one fact and not the other? Well, it fits with his purpose. You see, it's like a game to these people. They've always got to present something new. And that something new always has to stand against what the Bible claims about itself. So they concoct an idea and then perform mental gymnastics in order to project that idea back onto the text. And it seems to always serve the purpose of doing damage to the Bible as the inspired Word of God. Always. The last piece of the puzzle, document P, was postulated in 1853 by Hermann Hupfeld by further dividing E into two documents. The so-called priestly portion was extracted and given its own hypothetical author in its own letter, P for priestly. It was thought that the priests were primarily concerned with communicating instructions for rituals and sacrifices, genealogies, things of that nature, and so P accounts for the bulk of Leviticus along with the bits and pieces of other books. And so we end up with the constituent elements of what we now call JEDP theory, or the documentary hypothesis. Of course, it seems that none of its proponents can agree with one another as to which documents came first or which passages come from which document, but we're not going to go into any of that. While we're still on Hupfeld, he had one other innovation that's worth mentioning. You see, not all of the biblical data lined up with his theory. He had an idea, but the facts on the ground didn't support it. So what he did was conjure up a final redactor or editor. The person edited the text in various places, which would account for any anomalies in the so-called data. You might say they smudged the lines between the different documents. Hupfeld was able to explain away all the inconsistencies of his theory, for example, where a supposed J passage used terminology from an E source, by appealing to an editor who rearranged the whole of the Pentateuch. Isn't that convenient? Imagine sitting as the defendant in a murder trial. The prosecution claims that your fingerprints were on the murder weapon. But when the court looks at it, there are no fingerprints. Well, says the prosecutor, they were there until they were wiped off. No one actually saw the fingerprints, and we don't know who or why anyone would wipe them off. But no matter, they were there. They had to be there because you used it to kill the victim. Ridiculous? Yes. But it's essentially the same argument. How do they know there was a final editor? Well, because they need something to fill in the gaping holes of the theory. They need a way to distort the data to make it fit. And the only way to account for the lack of support for the theory is to fabricate an editor who wiped away the fingerprints. Okay, so I've got one more name to bring up. In 1877, Julius Wellhausen enters the fray. His contribution was not so much a development of the theory itself as it was to popularize it. He did this by relating JEDP to a reconstructed, that's code for fabricated, version of Israel's history along evolutionary lines. You see, Darwin's Origin of Species had just been released a few decades prior, and everyone wanted a piece of the evolutionary action. Wellhausen conjectured that J and E came out of the early stages of Israel's awareness of God, when the nation was a conglomeration of clans and traditions and local temples. Over time, prompted by the prophets, Israel eventually developed ethical monotheism. It was during Josiah's reform where his monotheism combined with the various traditions, which in turn produced a concern for the unity of the nation and centralization of worship. In response, the writer known as the Deuteronomist fabricated Israel's history into a unified whole, the D document. Over time, the various rituals developed and grew into a collection of priestly rites and instructions. These were part of the P document, which was absorbed into the other three, and then, of course, the pesky editor gave us all those data points that just don't quite fit the theory. Wellhausen's version of this patchwork Frankensteinian explanation was the most notable version for well over a century. During that time, believe it or not, To do scholarship on the Pentateuch required interaction with and allegiance to JEDP. But over the last half century or so, the theory, well, let's just say it's been tweaked. And now we have this convoluted mess that you see on your screen. Every time they're faced with another hole in the theory, they add another box to the diagram. It'd be kind of humorous if the stakes weren't so high. Well, it's about time to wrap up, but I do want to throw in one more thing before I let you go. This whole process reminds me of something from the history of science. You see, in the early 20th century, the views of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud were viewed as scientific approaches to economics and psychology. But their theories had the very strange characteristic of being very fluid. You might say that their theories rolled with the punches. Whatever data was presented, even if it were contradictory data, the theories would shapeshift and explain the anomaly. There was no way to refute them, even with contradictory evidence. Now, this is about the time that Albert Einstein came on the scene. Now, Einstein had presented his theories of special and then general relativity, but his theories had an entirely different quality to them than those of Marx and Freud. Einstein's theories offered the testable predictions concerning the outcomes of future experiments. And in 1919, the opportunity arose to test one of those predictions. A solar eclipse was coming up, and Einstein's theory of general relativity predicted a particular phenomenon concerning the passing of distant starlight near the sun. If the phenomenon were to be observed, it would support his theory. But if it didn't, it would definitively falsify it. And that was something that philosopher of science Karl Popper seized on. Real scientific theories are falsifiable. That is, there should be phenomena that, if they happen or fail to happen, whichever is appropriate, would lead to an abandonment of the theory. The theories of Marx and Freud could, by definition, never be falsified. And so Popper said that they were not real science. He referred to them as pseudoscience. And that is precisely what we have with JEDP theory. It's presented by its proponents as the result of scientific methodology, but nothing could be farther from the truth. When faced with contradictory or conflicting evidence, the theory shapeshifts in order to explain it away. If you ever talk to a proponent of this theory, ask him or her a very simple question. Under what circumstances would this theory be abandoned? Or what evidence, if it were to ever be discovered, would cause him or her to abandon the theory? The sad fact is that there is no way that that could ever happen. JEDP theory is pseudoscience if it is anything. Oh, and about Einstein's theory? Astronomer Arthur Eddington led an expedition to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa, where he and his research team could gain an optimal view of the eclipse. He was indeed able to observe the phenomena of the distant starlight surrounding the blocked-out sun, just as Einstein's theory had predicted. And that, my friends, is what you call real science. JEDP is pseudoscience and bad scholarship. In my opinion, it's even dishonest scholarship. Its adherents demonstrate a complete lack of awareness for their own presuppositions. And now that we know where the theory came from, next time we'll consider some of the most prominent arguments and then begin to respond to some of them. Until then, may God bless you.